The Cold War is usually remembered in steel and firebomber fleets, missile silos, divided cities, and men studying maps beneath the light of underground command rooms. Those decisions had already been made. Before the United States and the Soviet Union competed over nuclear arsenals, they competed over something less dramatic and more durable: who could rebuild factories, stabilize currencies, finance allies, move food and fuel across borders, and persuade exhausted populations that their system offered a future. The first decisive battlefield was not a launch pad. It was the Reconstruction ledger. And the question was not simply which superpower possessed more wealth in 1945, but which could turn that wealth into a self-reinforcing international order. To understand that contest, we have to return to a world still haunted by the economic disasters that had preceded the war. The Great Depression had not been remembered merely as a collapse in prices and employment. Policymakers saw competitive devaluations, protectionist barriers, frozen credit, and the fragmentation of trade into hostile blocs as forces that had weakened democracies and rewarded political extremism. By 1944, Allied planners were therefore thinking beyond victory. They wanted a system in which currencies would be stable enough for trade governments could obtain temporary financial assistance, and ruined economies would not be forced into the same cycle of austerity, unemployment, and radicalization. Economic order was becoming a security policy. Preventing another depression was not separate from preventing another war. It was part of the same project. That project took institutional form at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, where representatives from 44 countries met in July 1944. The arrangement they designed was not a pure free market, and it was not a return to the rigid pre-war gold standard. Participating countries would maintain fixed but adjustable exchange rates against the dollar, while the United States committed to convert official dollar holdings into gold at $35 an ounce. The International Monetary Fund would assist countries facing temporary payment problems. The institution that became the World Bank would support reconstruction and development. In practical terms, the dollar was becoming more than American currency. It was becoming a claim on the industrial output, financial credibility, and gold reserves of the most powerful economy left physically intact by the war. The mechanism mattered because Europe did not merely lack money, it lacked the specific currencies required to purchase what recovery demanded. A damaged railway could not be repaired with patriotic speeches. It needed steel locomotives, machine tools, coal-imported food and fuel. Many of those goods were available from the United States, but European governments and firms had too few dollars with which to buy them. This was the famous dollar shortage, and it revealed a central contradiction of the early post-war world. The United States needed foreign economies to recover so they could become stable partners and customers. Yet those economies could not recover without access to American production. Dollars had to leave the United States so that goods could leave American ports, factories could restart abroad, and trade could begin moving again. The Marshall Plan was the most visible answer. Signed into law in 1948, it ultimately received about $13.3 billion in congressional appropriations over 4 years. The money did not simply arrive as bundles of cash. It moved through shipments of food, fuel, machinery, raw materials, and financial arrangements intended to relieve bottlenecks and encourage European coordination. Its purpose was humanitarian, economic, and strategic at the same time. It helped governments address shortages and restore production. It supported markets for American goods. And it reduced the political appeal of communist parties that were strongest, where scarcity, unemployment, and governmental weakness were most severe. The plan did not single-handedly rebuild Western Europe. European labor domestic reforms, existing industrial skills, and regional cooperation were indispensable. But American assistance supplied time materials and confidence at a moment when all three were scarce. This is where the financial architecture became an alliance architecture. Washington did not simply transfer resources to individual governments and walk away. European states were pressed to cooperate, compare needs, reduce obstacles to trade, and create arrangements for settling payments among themselves. The later European Payments Union allowed countries to offset claims multilaterally rather than demanding scarce dollars for every bilateral transaction. A Belgian machine could be sold to France. French goods could move elsewhere, and accounts could be balanced across a wider network. The political meaning was larger than the accounting technique. Western Europe was being encouraged to become an integrated economic region connected to the United States but not permanently dependent on emergency charity. Recovery would make the alliance richer. Integration would make it harder to divide. From Moscow, the same system looked very different. Soviet leaders did not see American loans open accounts inspections and coordinated recovery plans as neutral instruments. They saw potential channels of political influence reaching toward governments on the Soviet Union's western frontier. That suspicion was rooted in genuine trauma. The Soviet state had survived invasion at an almost unimaginable human and physical cost. Its cities, farms, railways, and industrial regions had been devastated. Security, as Stalin understood it, required buffers, political obedience, and protection from dependence on a capitalist world that had repeatedly treated the Soviet Union as an enemy. When the United States presented reconstruction assistance on terms requiring information and coordination, the Kremlin feared that economic access would become strategic penetration. The Soviet answer was not participation under Western rules. It was separation. That decision helped divide Europe into two economic spaces. Eastern European governments were discouraged or prevented from joining the Marshall Program, while the Soviet Union tightened control over the region's political systems and directed trade through bilateral agreements. In 1949, Moscow and its allies created the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, later known as Comecon. It did not initially possess anything like the financial depth of the dollar system. Its strength came from administrative power. Governments could set production targets, negotiate quantities, fix official prices, and direct coal machinery, food oil, and industrial equipment across borders without relying on open currency markets. The advantage was control. The weakness was that control could conceal cost. A factory could fulfill its assigned quota while producing goods that other factories did not want, and an official price could remain stable while scarcity grew behind it. The Soviet model should not be dismissed as economic incompetence. Central planning had demonstrated a terrifying capacity to mobilize resources. Gosplan and the industrial ministries could channel investment towards steel, electricity, heavy machinery, armaments, railways, and giant construction projects. They could suppress consumption force savings into state investment and concentrate scientific talent on priorities selected by the leadership. For a country rebuilding after invasion while confronting a nuclear-armed rival, this capacity had an obvious logic. Soviet factories recovered, military production expanded, industrial cities rose from ruins. The system could demand sacrifice on a scale that a consumer democracy might resist. But its very success established a dangerous habit: the belief that every strategic problem could be solved by assigning another target building, another plant, extracting another sacrifice, and postponing the household economy until security had been achieved. The contrast became physical in Berlin. In 1948, the Western powers introduced currency reform in their occupation zones as part of a broader attempt to revive the German economy. The Soviet Union answered by blocking railroad and water access to the western sectors of the city. The crisis was about sovereignty, occupation rights, and the future of Germany, but currency stood at its center because money determined which administration could tax, pay wages, price goods, and claim political authority. The Western response was an airlift that supplied the isolated population for nearly a year. Aircraft carried flour, coal, medicine, and fuel into a city where the competing economic orders faced one another, street by street. The blockade failed to force the Western powers out. Instead, it turned logistics into political legitimacy and accelerated the division of Germany. Historians have argued ever since about what these years meant. The Orthodox account emphasizes Soviet coercion in Eastern Europe and the need for Western containment. Revisionist historians have stressed the way American leaders linked national security to an open international economy receptive to American trade and investment. Each interpretation captures part of the machinery. The United States did seek markets' monetary stability and an international environment compatible with its economic power. It also confronted a Soviet government that imposed compliant regimes, restricted political choice, and treated strategic depth as a requirement of survival. The Soviet Union had legitimate fears of renewed invasion and foreign dependence. It answered them by building a sphere whose security rested increasingly on exclusion and compulsion. The conflict was neither a misunderstanding nor a secret commercial plot. It was a collision between two incompatible methods of organizing recovery and power. Then Korea transformed the scale of the competition. Before 1950, American officials debated how much military strength containment required and whether the economy could support it without undermining civilian recovery. NSC 68 called for a broad buildup of Western power, but the political path to financing that vision remained uncertain. The North Korean invasion of South Korea changed the calculation. Between 1950 and 1953, American defense spending rose from roughly 5% to more than 14% of gross domestic product. Factories that had returned to civilian production expanded military lines again. Foreign aid alliance commitments, rearmament, and economic planning became parts of one permanent security system. The Soviet bloc responded with its own buildup, tightening the priority given to defense and heavy industry. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had acquired its missiles armies and military alliances. But beneath them stood the original contest, one order, trying to multiply power through dollars trade and allied recovery, and another trying to guarantee security through planning control and concentrated sacrifice. The question now was which system could sustain that burden without turning its own strengths into weaknesses. The next stage of the Cold War was fought as much in supermarkets and research laboratories as in missile fields. By the mid-1950s, both superpowers had demonstrated that they could build armies, weapons, and industrial complexes. The more difficult test was whether they could make ordinary life appear to improve while carrying the permanent cost of military competition. A refrigerator, an apartment, a television, or a reliable supply of meat could become evidence in an ideological argument. So could a satellite crossing the night sky. The United States and the Soviet Union were no longer competing only to survive. They were competing to prove that their economic system could produce modernity itself. That required growth, scientific prestige, consumer loyalty, and the ability to support allies far beyond their own borders. The Western recovery that followed was not the simple triumph of an untouched free market. American security guarantees allowed Western European governments to spend less than they otherwise might have spent defending themselves, while trade integration opened larger markets for their industries. Private investment mattered, but so did state-directed reconstruction, public housing infrastructure, welfare programs, industrial policy, and American military procurement. Japan and Western Europe rebuilt productive capacity with newer machinery-educated workers and access to expanding international commerce. American companies gained customers and investment opportunities, but the Allies also became increasingly capable competitors. The system's strength came from this apparent contradiction. The United States did not need to own every factory. It benefited when Allied factories became productive enough to buy, sell, innovate, and help finance the common security structure. The Soviet Union also entered the post-Stalin years with achievements that were impossible to dismiss. It had rebuilt cities, expanded electricity generation, trained millions of engineers and technicians, and established formidable capabilities in metallurgy, aviation, mathematics, nuclear science, and military production. New apartment blocks offered families an escape from overcrowded communal housing. Mass education created expectations of scientific and social advancement. For a time, the system's growth seemed to confirm that central planning could close the distance with the capitalist powers. Yet much of that growth still came from adding more labor, extracting more raw materials, and directing more investment into heavy industry. It was easier for the planners to order another steel mill than to calculate whether thousands of different factories were receiving the correct components at the correct quality at the moment they were actually needed. Sputnik revealed both the power and the limitation of this model. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union placed the first artificial satellite into orbit. The small object carried enormous political weight. It suggested that a country once dismissed as technologically backward had mastered rockets capable of reaching space and perhaps delivering nuclear weapons across continents. Centralized authority had concentrated resources, scientific expertise, and institutional attention on a clearly defined mission. When success could be measured by whether a satellite entered orbit, the command system could perform brilliantly. But an economy is not one mission. It is millions of changing decisions about materials, repairs designs, transport prices, preferences, and risk. The Soviet state could prioritize a breakthrough. It struggled to make breakthrough innovation spread routinely across civilian production. The American response showed a different method of mobilization. Washington increased federal support for science, aerospace, education, computing, and advanced military technology, but much of the work moved through universities, laboratories, defense contractors, and private firms, rather than through one planning ministry. Military contracts guaranteed demand for expensive research whose commercial value was not yet clear. Universities trained specialists with public funding. Companies competed for contracts, absorbed knowledge, and eventually adapted some technologies for civilian markets. This system could be wasteful, politically manipulated, and heavily dependent on government spending. It was not laissez-faire, but it allowed several institutions to pursue the same technological problem, fail in different ways, and transfer knowledge across organizational boundaries. The competition was therefore not simply state planning against private enterprise. It was one form of state-directed innovation against another. Technology itself became a controlled strategic resource. Through the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, the United States and its allies restricted the sale of selected military and dual-use products to the Communist bloc. Advanced machine tools, electronics, computing equipment, and other technologies could strengthen both civilian industry and weapons production. The controls were never airtight. Western allies disagreed over which products should be restricted. Commercial interests pushed for access to Eastern markets, and Soviet organizations obtained technology through legal purchases, intermediaries copying, and intelligence operations. Even so, every denied machine or delayed component could increase the cost of modernization. Export control was not a dramatic blockade. It was economic friction deliberately inserted into the Soviet development process. Comcon attempted to produce a different kind of integration. Socialist governments coordinated production, assigned specializations, and settled much of their trade through administered arrangements rather than freely convertible currencies. In theory, one country could concentrate on machinery, another on chemicals, and another on transport equipment, while the Soviet Union supplied energy and raw materials. In practice, national planners resisted dependence on neighboring states. Official prices often reacted slowly to world market changes, and the transferable ruble could not function like a dollar that governments, firms, and households could freely use almost anywhere. Trade certainly occurred, and the bloc was not economically motionless, but the system had difficulty revealing whether a product was genuinely competitive or merely delivered, because a plan required another government to accept it. The rivalry expanded across the newly independent states of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. American officials offered development loans, food assistance, technical experts, and access to Western markets. Soviet engineers helped construct dams, steelworks, oil facilities, and other highly visible projects. Both sides provided scholarships and military equipment. A power station could promise industrial independence while tying a government to foreign technicians' replacement parts. And diplomatic expectations. Food aid could prevent immediate suffering while altering domestic agricultural incentives. Weapons could secure a regime without creating the productive economy required to maintain them. Leaders in the developing world were not merely passive pieces on a superpower chessboard. They negotiated shifted alignment and played competing offers against one another. But the result was often development shaped by Cold War strategy rather than by local needs alone. Inside the superpowers, ordinary citizens experienced these systems through unequal combinations of achievement and frustration. An American factory worker could purchase goods unimaginable to the previous generation, while fearing automation, inflation, recession, or the disappearance of industrial work. A Soviet engineer might help design an advanced aircraft or guidance system, then spend hours searching for shoes meat or replacement parts for a household appliance. The contradiction was not that the Soviet Union possessed no consumer economy. Living standards had risen substantially since the devastation of war. The deeper problem was that shortages and poor quality communicated something politically dangerous. The state could solve tasks it declared strategic, while repeatedly failing to satisfy needs that citizens themselves considered important. The Western order also entered a serious crisis. American military commitments, overseas investment, foreign aid, and the Vietnam War sent dollars abroad. At the same time, the recovery of Europe and Japan meant that American manufacturers faced stronger competition. Foreign governments accumulated dollar claims that could, under Bretton Woods rules, be presented to the United States for gold. The system depended on the United States supplying the world with dollars. Yet the growing quantity of dollars outside the country weakened confidence in the promise that each official claim could be converted at the fixed gold price. What had once made the dollar order expansive now made its original rules increasingly difficult to defend. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the conversion of official foreign dollar holdings into American gold. The decision was an admission that the original Bretton Woods arrangement could no longer operate as designed. It was accompanied by domestic wage and price controls and an import surcharge intended to force negotiations over exchange rates and trade. Yet the end of gold convertibility did not produce the end of the dollar's international role. Governments, banks, and companies still needed a widely accepted currency for reserves, contracts, lending, and trade. The United States still possessed large financial markets, political alliances, military power, and an economy capable of issuing assets the rest of the world was willing to hold. The rules had broken, but much of the network survived. Then oil redistributed pressure across both blocs. The price shocks of the 1970s produced inflation, unemployment, and political anger in the importing economies of the West. Motorists waited in fuel lines while central banks confronted the difficult combination of rising prices and weakening growth. But expensive energy also generated immense financial flows for oil exporters. Banks received deposits that could be recycled into loans. For the Soviet Union, rising oil and gas revenues brought hard currency that could purchase grain machinery, industrial equipment, and selected Western technology. The apparent lesson was reassuring natural resources could cover weaknesses elsewhere in the economy. In reality, the new income reduced the urgency of reform and made the Soviet system increasingly vulnerable to forces it could not plan the world price of the commodities it exported. This dependence complicates the old image of two completely separate world economies. The Soviet Union sought self-reliance, but it also needed international markets. Poor harvests encouraged large grain purchases. Industrial bottlenecks created demand for Western equipment. Oil sales produced the convertible currency required to pay for imports. Historian Oscar Sanchez-Sibony has challenged the idea that the Soviet Union existed as a sealed alternative civilization, arguing instead that it remained exposed to global commercial forces even while rejecting the political principles of the liberal economic order. The paradox was becoming clear. Moscow condemned dependence on capitalism. While relying on capitalist markets to obtain goods, its planned economy could not supply efficiently enough. Eastern European governments moved even further into Western finance. During détente commercial, banks were increasingly willing to lend convertible currencies to socialist states. Officials in Poland and elsewhere believed that imported machinery and technology would raise productivity, expand exports, and generate the hard currency needed to repay the debt. The plan appeared rational. Borrow now, modernize industry, sell better goods abroad, and service the loans from future earnings. But when productivity improvements disappointed, energy costs rose, and export performance weakened, the debts remained. Governments could not solve the problem simply by printing more domestic currency because Western creditors expected repayment in dollars or other convertible money. Credit had postponed difficult reforms. It had also placed parts of the socialist bloc under the discipline of an external financial system they did not control. By the end of the 1970s, neither side had achieved the clean victory its ideology promised. The United States had survived the breakdown of gold convertibility, but it faced inflation, industrial competition, a social conflict, and the political consequences of Vietnam. The Soviet Union had reached nuclear parity and gained oil income, yet its growth was slowing. Its allies were borrowing abroad, and its civilian economy remained difficult to modernize. Then Soviet forces entered Afghanistan in December 1979. The intervention added another stream of military expenditure, supply obligations, diplomatic isolation, and human loss, just as the wider economic environment was becoming less forgiving. The oil revenues and Western credits that had concealed weakness could not conceal it forever. The Cold War was entering its final financial phase in which debt, technology, resource prices, and reform would determine whether military power could still be converted into political control. By the beginning of the 1980s, the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy its principal rival, yet it had less freedom to shape its own economic future. This was the final contradiction of the Cold War. Strategic parity had not produced financial parity, technological flexibility, or a more productive civilian economy. The Soviet state could still move armies, launch spacecraft, subsidize allies, and command vast quantities of steel and fuel. What it could not easily do was reduce one commitment without threatening another. Military factories supported entire cities. Cheap energy held the Eastern Bloc together. Controlled prices protected household expectations. Foreign aid sustained distant governments. Each obligation had acquired a political constituency, and every attempt to reform the system risked revealing costs that planning had hidden for decades. The warning arrived first in Poland, where foreign loans had been expected to finance a modern industrial future. During the 1970s, the Polish government borrowed convertible currency from Western banks, imported machinery, and promised that higher productivity and stronger exports would eventually repay the debt. Instead, inefficient investment, weak export earnings, rising import costs, and domestic shortages turned modernization into dependence. In March 1981, Poland informed its bank creditors that it could not meet all its obligations. By the end of the decade, after repeated rescheduling and capitalized interest, its convertible currency debt had reached more than $40 billion, nearly 5 times its annual exports in convertible currencies. The numbers mattered because the government could create zlotys, but it could not create dollars. Debt had transformed a domestic production failure into an international constraint. That constraint entered daily life through prices, ration cards, and queues. Polish authorities faced a choice that had become familiar across the socialist bloc. They could continue subsidizing food and wages, worsening the fiscal and external imbalance, or impose price increases that revealed how little the economy could actually afford. Workers had been promised security-stable prices and protection from capitalist unemployment. Now they were being asked to sacrifice in order to satisfy creditors and repair a system managed by the same party that had made those promises. The rise of solidarity cannot be reduced to foreign debt. It grew from labor organization, political repression, national identity, and demands for dignity. But the debt crisis narrowed the government's choices and exposed the gap between official guarantees and material capacity. Financial weakness had become a crisis of political legitimacy. Western banks occupied an uncomfortable position in this drama. They had not designed communist rule, and they did not secretly control its collapse. They had simply lent to governments that appeared politically stable, strategically important, and implicitly supported by the Soviet Union. Once Poland could not pay, an immediate default threatened losses for commercial banks and wider diplomatic disruption. Creditors therefore negotiated rescheduling rather than demanding instant settlement. Western governments, banks, and socialist officials became partners in preventing a financial breakdown none of them wanted. Yet every postponement increased the accumulated burden. Credit had once allowed communist governments to delay reform. Debt service now forced them to confront the discipline of a financial system operating outside their political authority. The Soviet Union had one advantage: most of its allies lacked oil and natural gas that could be sold for hard currency. Energy exports paid for grain, industrial equipment, and selected technologies that domestic production could not provide reliably. They also supported military commitments and economic assistance abroad. But oil income created a dangerous illusion. When export revenues were strong, the leadership could compensate for agricultural weakness, import machinery, and postpone structural change without dismantling central planning. The state appeared to possess strategic independence while becoming increasingly exposed to a price determined in world markets. Petroleum did not cause Soviet stagnation, but it helped conceal it. A resource that strengthened Moscow's international position also allowed the domestic system to avoid learning how to generate comparable value through productivity, quality, and innovation. Afghanistan added another burden to a structure already struggling to adapt. The Soviet intervention required troops' aircraft fuel equipment, replacement weapons subsidies for the Afghan government, and support for a long supply network through difficult terrain. Its economic cost alone did not bankrupt the Soviet Union, and comparisons with the American war in Vietnam can easily become misleading. The larger significance was cumulative. Afghanistan consumed resources while damaging relations with the West, complicating trade and deepening public cynicism. Soviet families received official language about international duty. While wounded conscripts returned from a conflict, the state could neither explain openly nor conclude successfully. The war became another commitment that appeared manageable in isolation, but dangerous when combined with military competition, allied subsidies, technological weakness, and declining growth. The United States intensified that competition during the Reagan years. American defense spending increased, new weapons programs moved forward, and the Strategic Defense Initiative suggested that the next contest might involve computing sensors, space systems, and technologies requiring enormous research capacity. Washington also maintained restrictions on strategically useful exports and applied pressure across several regional conflicts. These policies mattered because Soviet leaders could not assume that existing forces would remain sufficient. Yet the United States carried its own deficits and political conflicts. Its advantage was not costless spending. It was the ability to finance expenditure in a currency widely held around the world, borrow through deep capital markets, draw technology from a broad alliance network, and reduce or redirect programs, without dismantling the entire economic system supporting them. Claims that Reagan simply spent the Soviet Union into bankruptcy are therefore too clean. Measuring the Soviet defense burden was extraordinarily difficult because official budgets concealed military activity. Administrative prices did not reflect market costs, and analysts had to reconstruct programs from physical production. Western estimates changed as new information and methodologies appeared. Even the CIA revised major conclusions about the growth and scale of Soviet expenditure. The broad picture is clear: defense absorbed a much larger share of Soviet resources than official figures admitted, and competed with civilian investment and consumption. But the burden did not rise in one uninterrupted line, and Moscow did not mechanically match every American initiative. Military pressure was an accelerant. The deeper weakness was an economy in which protecting strategic power required sacrificing the very modernization needed to sustain it. The technological gap made that sacrifice harder to conceal. Soviet research institutions could produce exceptional achievements in mathematics, physics, aerospace, and weapons design. The problem lay in converting advanced knowledge into flexible production across thousands of ordinary enterprises. Computerization, telecommunications, precision manufacturing, logistics, and quality control required rapid feedback and reliable information. The planning system rewarded managers for fulfilling numerical targets, often by hoarding inputs, resisting design changes, and producing the quantity demanded even when quality deteriorated. A ministry could declare a plan completed, while a factory waited for missing components and shops remained empty. The system did not lack intelligent people. It trapped them inside incentives that punished truthful reporting and made adaptation appear more dangerous than delay. Then, the external cushion weakened. The sharp fall in world oil prices in 1986 reduced Soviet export earnings and damaged the government budget just as the leadership was trying to accelerate industrial modernization. Moscow responded by increasing some export volumes, reducing imports, and experimenting with new foreign exchange arrangements. But these measures could not quickly replace the lost revenue or correct decades of distorted prices. The oil decline was not a financial weapon that single-handedly destroyed the Soviet state. Nor does the evidence support a simple story in which Washington secretly controlled every movement in the market. Its importance was that it exposed an existing dependence. The Soviet economy had not suddenly become inefficient in 1986. It had suddenly become less able to purchase relief from inefficiency. Mikhail Gorbachev understood that stagnation threatened the Soviet Union's status and future. His first response emphasized acceleration, discipline, new machinery, better management, and campaigns against corruption and alcohol abuse. When these measures failed to produce the expected revival, reform moved deeper. Enterprises received greater autonomy. Cooperatives were permitted in parts of the economy. Foreign trade controls were loosened. Public criticism expanded under glasnost. Yet the old command mechanisms were weakened before a coherent market system, commercial banking structure, legal framework, or realistic price mechanism could replace them. Managers gained freedom without facing consistent financial discipline. Ministries lost authority while continuing to issue orders. The result was not a smooth transition from planning to markets, but an increasingly unstable overlap of both. The fiscal consequences became severe. Subsidies remained expensive, revenue-weakened enterprises demanded credit, and money continued entering the economy without a matching increase in goods available at official prices. Households and enterprises accumulated balances they could not spend freely, creating what economists called a monetary overhang. The currency still existed, wages were still paid, and savings remained recorded in bank accounts. But shelves and supply chains communicated a different reality. Money was losing its ability to command goods. Shortages encouraged hoarding, barter, privilege distribution, and informal markets. A citizen could possess rubles and still lack meaningful choice. The state had not literally run out of money. It was losing control over what its money represented. Political reform magnified the economic crisis by making suppressed conflicts visible. Glasnost exposed past crimes, environmental disasters, corruption, and the falsification of official success. Competitive elections and stronger public institutions weakened the Communist Party's monopoly. Soviet republics demanded greater authority over taxes, production language, and natural resources. Russian leaders increasingly challenged the Union government itself. Gorbachev hoped that openness would create support for a renewed socialism, but it also gave citizens the means to organize against the institutions he was trying to repair. Economic failure undermined political authority, while political decentralization made coordinated economic reform harder. The center was attempting to surrender, coercion, restructure, ownership, renegotiate the Union, and preserve superpower status at the same time. The same choice transformed Eastern Europe. Earlier Soviet leaders had used or threatened force when Allied governments moved beyond acceptable limits. Gorbachev did not repeat that response when communist regimes faced mass opposition in 1989. Poland negotiated a political transition. Hungary opened its borders. East Germans crossed westward or filled the streets. The Berlin Wall fell in November, not because the Soviet Union had no soldiers capable of defending it, but because Moscow was no longer willing to pay the political and human price of using them. Economic weakness limited Soviet leverage, but restraint was still a choice. An empire sustained partly by coercion began to disappear when its leadership refused to renew coercion on the scale required. This is why no single victory story is sufficient. The triumphalist interpretation is right that Western economic strength, technological competition, alliance, cohesion, and American pressure constrained Soviet choices. The institutional interpretation is right that central planning had developed deep problems of productivity, information, incentives, and innovation. Historian Fritz Bartel emphasizes another dimension. Western and Eastern governments had made social promises that became increasingly expensive, but capitalist democracies proved more capable of imposing financial discipline and restructuring those promises. Vladislav Zubok, meanwhile, warns against treating dissolution as inevitable and places greater weight on the disruptive sequence of Gorbachev's reforms and the political struggle between the Union Center and the republics. These arguments are not mutually exclusive. They explain different levels of the same collapse. In August 1991, opponents of Gorbachev attempted to seize power and preserve a union already slipping beyond the center's control. The coup failed, but it destroyed what remained of the Communist Party's authority and strengthened Boris Yeltsin and the leaders of the republics. By December, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. It did not disappear because it had run out of missiles engineers, oil territory, or educated citizens. It disappeared because the institutions joining those assets together could no longer produce dependable growth, enforce political unity, finance every commitment, or persuade enough people that reform within the Union offered a credible future. The conventional Cold War story ends with military pressure and ideological defeat. The deeper story ends with a system that could manufacture extraordinary power, but could not reproduce the flexibility, consent, and economic coordination required to sustain it. The missiles in the opening image were real. They mattered, and the danger they represented shaped nearly half a century. But they were never the complete measure of superpower strength. The United States prevailed not because its economy was perfectly free, fair, or stable, but because its dollar markets, research institutions, firms, allies, and political mechanisms formed a network capable of surviving crises and changing course. The Soviet system could mobilize faster than many of its rivals imagined, but it could not adapt without weakening the controls that held it together. That was the final price of the Cold War, not simply the money spent on weapons, but the societies bent around maintaining them. If this documentary changed how you understand the conflict, subscribe to the Price of History docs and like the video. In the comments, tell us which factor mattered most: the arms race, the technology gap, oil and debt, central planning, or Gorbachev's decisions.